Watch your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 8 of CN Live. I'm Elizabeth Vos.
And I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
In a dramatic series of moves at Westminster this week, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was twice defeated on bills to prevent a no-deal Brexit and to hold a general election on October 15. We'll be joined by Scottish journalist John Wight from Edinburgh to break down the complicated parliamentary manoeuvres and to discuss the role of the United States and Donald Trump in all of this.
It's been a dramatic few days in Westminster, to be sure. Prime Minister Boris Johnson lost a vote on Wednesday to prevent a no-deal Brexit, and he called for a second bill to have a general election on October 15th. That was voted down in the first reading. We understand there'll be another one on Monday. That October 15th election date would be just days before the British Prime Minister, whoever it is to meet with EU officials. Johnson has called, and the Daily Telegraph, I have to add, has called Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, a hypocrite for not agreeing to a general election after he's been calling for one for months. But it appears that Corbyn may have higher interests involved here in mind rather than his own political fortunes. Wanting a ban on the no deal that Boris Johnson had been threatening before a possible election might be a way to prevent rapacious U.S. interests from getting into the British market, essentially raiding Britain in some kind of Trump-Johnson sweetheart deal. So I see the United States as playing a big role here. We are joined from Edinburgh, is that correct, John?
Yes, Edinburgh, Scotland.
From Edinburgh, Scotland, by John Wight. He's a journalist, and he's a keen observer of British politics. And we welcome you to CN Live. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you, Joe.
So now that this bill has passed, a no-deal Brexit is not possible. Where does this leave Johnson? And am I correct in my assessment that he's looking to get out without a deal with the EU so he can make one with Trump?
Absolutely correct in every particular. Johnson's been in post for 6 weeks. He has not been elected Prime Minister. He assumed office after his predecessor, Theresa May, resigned after 3 years of failed negotiations with the EU. She came up with a withdrawal bill that nobody liked across the board. Johnson assumed office promising to fulfill the will of the people, in his words, by making sure Britain comes out of the EU on the 31st of October with a deal or with no deal. But he's been entirely disingenuous the whole way through because he's never been interested in a deal. His preference is for a no deal. And he received the stamp of approval of one Donald J. Trump at the G20 in Biarritz. And Donald Trump, when Boris Johnson first put to Parliament that he was going to suspend parliamentary business for 5 weeks, this is unprecedented, and he received the permission of the Queen. Now think about how undemocratic that is. A Prime Minister who has not yet received a mandate from the British people as Prime Minister going to an unelected head of state to receive permission to suspend the elected Parliament in order to drive through a no-deal Brexit in violation of Parliament. Parliament does not want a no-deal Brexit. When people voted on the 23rd of June 2016, they did not vote per se for a no-deal Brexit. They just voted for Brexit in the majority, a 4% majority. No deal was not on the ballot paper. And why is no deal important, Joe? Because 3 million UK jobs are dependent on Britain's current relationship with the EU. Supply chains will be disrupted. The government produced its own document forecasting what the initial consequences of no deal would be, and it makes chilling reading. We're talking about the potential shortages of medicines, of food, chaos at the ports because new custom arrangements would come in place, and most particularly of all, the peace in the north of Ireland, which has held sway since the late 1990s. That would be in peril because there would be the possibility of the reimposition of a hard border between the 6 counties in the north of Ireland that are controlled by the UK and the 26-county Irish Republic, which is a EU member state, again because of a change in customs arrangements. That could be a catalyst for a return to conflict in the north of Ireland. But Boris Johnson and his gang of hard Brexiteers are not interested in that because we know that this Tory establishment and a significant section of the British security establishment has never accepted the Good Friday Agreement, which is the name given to the peace document that was introduced by then Tony Blair with the other parties involved in that conflict. They've always seen it as a surrender document. So I have no doubt that they would have no problem with the prospect of British troops reappearing on the streets of Belfast, in Derry and other parts of the north of Ireland. So Johnson is clearly trying to make this a people versus parliament dynamic, with he and his other gang of old Etonians at the head of the people, fulfilling the will of the people and their rhetoric. But as Albert Camus said, to paraphrase the French philosopher and writer, the will of the people has always been the alibi of tyrants. The man's a complete opportunist. And this, I think, Joe, has moved beyond Brexit or Remain. It's moved to the condition of whether you stand on the ground of the politics of socialism and solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn, or you stand on the ground of US vassalage and disaster capitalism with Boris Johnson and his hard Brexit Taliban.
Now, Corbyn is not doing that well in the polls. The Labour Party is around 30-something%. Would not probably win an outright majority. If there were a general election, I was talking about another coalition government. I think Labour have been doing better previously. But do you think that he's putting Britain's interests above his own and wanting to stop this no Brexit deal first before he has a general election?
Absolutely.
Or am I being, yeah.
He is well aware of the impact on working class people of a no-deal Brexit, even though a lot of working class people in England, especially, and in Wales, which are the two constituent nations that voted for Brexit. Just so your viewers who may not be aware of the UK. UK is not a country. The UK is a state made up of three historically constituted nations: Scotland, Wales and England, and the colonised, in my view, 6 counties of the north of Ireland. In Scotland, 62% of people voted to remain. 55% of people in the north of Ireland voted to remain. So this Brexit vote was delivered by people in England and Wales. Jeremy Corbyn is putting the country first. We know that he is, by instinct, a Eurosceptic, but he understands that this issue is being dominated by the hard right, the most reactionary forces in Britain, and the impact to the 3 million jobs which I mentioned. But you say that Jeremy Corbyn is not doing well in the polls, and you're very correct in that. But think about this, Joe. In 2017, when Theresa May called the general election, she did so when Corbyn was over 20% below her in the polls. And because of his manifesto of reinvestment, of wealth redistribution, of ending austerity, the most savage austerity programme of any Western democracy in the world, 10 years of Tory austerity, 120,000 people have died as a direct result of austerity. People are suffering unparalleled levels of despair. It's like 19th century Victorian levels of poverty in this country. The inequality is through the roof. So Corbyn is a man who has a manifesto that would address all these things. And I think after the 2017 election, when Theresa May, who had a parliamentary majority going in, she lost that majority because Corbyn's manifesto of wealth redistribution and an end to austerity lit everything up. And he is not a great performer at the dispatch point in Parliament, but he's fantastic as a people person. When he gets around the country, people respond to him warmly, despite the demonisation that he has received in the right-wing press in this country.
So let me ask you about two things. You mentioned the results of the referendum in both Northern Ireland and Scotland. So in Northern Ireland, it was 55% decided to remain.
Yeah. So
what does that say about the future of North and South and the Republic of Ireland?
Here's the ironic thing.
Was there a chance of a actual unification of Ireland?
I think it's inevitable. I can't say when, but I think there's a shift in consciousness in Ireland because the younger generation is not coming into its maturity with the old traditions of sectarianism and bigotry and so forth that previous generations have come. But a key thing about, Bill Clinton was right in one sense when he said it's the economy stupid. Ireland, the north of Ireland has benefited enormously from EU membership because agricultural subsidies, it's a very highly agricultural economy in Ireland, and they've benefited from the subsidies that have flowed from the EU. So yes, there could be a move towards reunification, especially if the economy tanks in light of a hard Brexit, which I fully believe it would. But Scotland is another case. In 2014, we went to the polls in a referendum on Scottish independence, and I was opposed to it then. And I do regret that now, because I believed in working class unity across the country's historically constituted nations. But we were told in Scotland by the No campaign, led by David Cameron, the then Tory Prime Minister, that the condition of Scotland remaining in the EU would be to vote no and remain in the UK. And here we have, 2 years later, this referendum and Brexit. 62%, as I mentioned earlier, So vote, that's a decisive majority. So the first thing that would happen the day after a no-deal Brexit came to pass would be the train of Scottish independence hurtling down the tracks. And the polls in favour of Scottish independence have never been higher in favour of Scottish independence. People have had enough in Scotland of being dragged of this Tory government. Tories are reviled in Scotland, but a sharp lens is now being shone on this country's what passes for a constitution, because what has been exposed in these last weeks, where an unelected Prime Minister received permission from an unelected head of state, the Queen, to dissolve the elected Parliament, what has been exposed are the very weak democratic foundations of a country which, in conjunction with the US, is never done lecturing the rest of the world about democracy, and indeed on regular occasions drops bombs on countries in the name of democracy. So what this has achieved, Johnson's démarche, has been to light up the case for constitutional reform, support for Scottish independence, and an end to the UK.
When could another referendum on Scottish independence be held, do you think?
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, the head of the Scottish Nationalist Party, has said if no deal Brexit comes to pass, she'll be wanting to hold one in the summer of 2020. So very, very soon. There is real, this is a colonial relic of a state. The UK was forged in mercantilism, born in mercantilism in the interest of a rising colonial class. And it's no longer fit for purpose. It's underpinned by semi-feudal institutions, the monarchy, an unelected second chamber, the House of Lords, a Privy Council, an unelected and unaccountable judiciary. And people are starting to wake up to the reality of this, especially the younger generation. It's the young people who have been driving this no Brexit campaign. And it's very inspiring to see, Joe. Just like the young people are the life force of this Extinction Rebellion. They are really the hope for us. We fought our battles, we've lost many, but it's the young people that give me hope, because they benefit from being part of a larger polity. And at a time when the world is integrating closer more and more, China with its One Belt, One Road initiative, Russia with the Eurasian Union initiative, here we have the two prime Western English-speaking nations, the US and the UK, going on an isolationist path, going on ever object, because the neoliberal economic model which sustains the West is in all but name is dead. And it's only being life forced by these savage austerity programs. And the only thing needs to bury the corpse. That is what's causing these crises. And this crisis is obviously hitting the EU as well, which is a neoliberal EU. But my view is this is a case where the cure is worse than the disease. And these are the forces of nativism, of xenophobia, of anti-immigration, of empire nostalgia, and a British exceptionalism that has succeeded in sowing false consciousness large swathe of a predominantly English, predominantly white, deindustrialised working class as to the reasons for their powerless condition.
You say that Britain and the US are going down the isolationist path, but they're still very deeply involved all over the world. The US has over 800 bases, and Britain pretty much attached itself to the US empire when they officially lost theirs, but their intelligence agencies are everywhere. They're involved in terrible things, and the biggest one, of course, was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. My question is, if England becomes independent, in other words, Scotland is independent, Northern Ireland joins the Republic, and England is on its own, and Wales probably would want to leave too, would that weaken Britain's current influence, mostly malign, around the world? Would that be, in a sense, a positive thing?
Absolutely positive. It would be a benefit to mankind, given Britain's malign role in the world, which predates its membership of the EU by 4 centuries. You're absolutely right. These are imperial states. Britain is a loyal henchman of the US, imperialism. And it would be even more so after Brexit, because it would need the US for our trade deal. And we saw a glimpse of what this would entail, Joe, when British Royal Marines were used to storm the Iranian oil tanker in the Straits of Gibraltar at the behest of the Trump administration. So Britain would be wedded to US foreign policy in a way that it never has been before. And this would be a disaster, because Britain, already a piratical state, a state that whose crimes, in the words of the great Irish revolutionary James Connolly, would shame all the devils in hell, would be even more wedded to this empire emanating from Washington. When I say isolationist, I mean protectionism, I mean economically isolated, I mean trying to draw these...
Anti-immigration, that kind of thing,
but certainly, 800 bases in over 70 countries around the world. They're not there to make the world safe for democracy, as you know. They're there to make the world safe for the ability of Western, predominantly US corporations to plunder the planet's natural and human resources. So these would be the two most malign actors. But the thing that gives Britain its prestige in the world stage, it's been able to enlarge it on the world stage as a major power under the umbrella of US hegemony. But its Trident nuclear missiles gives it its permanent seat at the Security Council at the UN. But those Trident nuclear missiles are in Scotland. And a key component of Scottish independence is to scrap these Trident nuclear missiles. And without those and the prestige that comes with those, it would be very difficult to see how England, little England, could continue to keep its status as a world power. And indeed, I think it's already lost that status, Joe. I mean, this crisis has really revealed how much of a backward-looking state it is, that there's a colonial relic in every particular, and it only, as I say, has been able to pose on the world stage as a major power at the behest of the US.
That would be an interesting battle at the UN about whether England could take over a British seat with the veto.
Yes.
I mean, the Russian Federation was able to get it when the Soviet Union dissolved.
Yes.
But I wonder England would survive or not. But you still think it would be even a truncated English army instead of a British army, but still, with its intelligence services, still in team with the US, still wreak havoc, wouldn't it?
It would still wreak havoc because Britain is renowned for its intelligence services and also its special forces. They are renowned as being among the best in the world. So on that level, they would still pack a punch, and they would still be of use to the US and the empire in that regard. Yeah, but it would be a huge loss of national prestige, and that's very important amongst ruling classes. It's an abstract thing. It's not tangible, but it is palpable, and it does hold sway. And Britain has a large soft power outreach as well. It's very much a cultural hegemony with the BBC World Service. And obviously its newspapers and so on. So it does have some reach. It would still retain some reach, and it would still keep up a malign presence. That's unless Jeremy Corbyn is elected as Prime Minister. The reason they hate Jeremy Corbyn so much, the reason he's received such a drubbing of unprecedented levels, demonisation, real enemy of the people stuff in the right-wing Tory press, is not because of his domestic programme. They can live with that. It actually makes economic sense. Investing, reinvesting, reintroducing aggregate demand in the real economy and so on. It's on foreign policy. He supports the Palestinians. He would be against the arms trade with the Saudis, which is second only to the United States. The NATO membership would be imperiled under Corbyn. That's why they hate him, and that's why they're determined, come what may, to make sure he doesn't get into Downward 10 Downing Street. And I wouldn't put anything past these people to do whatever it takes to make sure that doesn't happen.
He'd also probably let Julian Assange go, Elizabeth.
Absolutely.
Well, just as a side note for a moment, your description of why they hate Corbyn so much reminds me a lot of, some similar candidates in the United States who are hated and smeared in the press because of their anti-war stances. But you've given us a really dire image of what happens in a no-deal Brexit, and I wanted to ask you how likely that is going forward. Can you explain what you think will happen as we watch this kind of crisis unfold?
Well, the situation has moved to the point where I voted to remain in the EU, as I mentioned earlier, because I believe the cure is worse than the disease. It doesn't mean I'm a fulsome supporter of the EU. Jeremy Corbyn's official stance in that campaign as head of the Labour Party was remain and reform, try and reform the EU. The EU has much to answer for in terms of being responsible for this crisis because of its role in impoverishing Greece, its lack of democratic institutions, and obviously there's been issues around the collapse of neoliberalism and how that's put pressure on economies and on societies because of free movement of people. That is the real driver of the Brexit vote. But the no deal for me is now off the table. The issue is now whether you have a no deal Brexit or a negotiated Brexit. I'm not hard remain. I don't think we can go back to where things were in 2016. We had a referendum. 17.4 million people did vote to Brexit. And if they were to just ignore that result, that would have ramifications for social cohesion going forward for many, many years to come. So I think it's a negotiated Brexit where you try and retain a trade relationship with the EU, but you come out in a managed way that doesn't imperil these 3 million jobs I mentioned, supply chains and peace in Ireland, which is really, really important. So that's the two poles. Corbyn standing for a negotiated Brexit or a hard Brexit, a fundamentalist Brexit. The fundamentalist Brexit has been defeated in the Parliament after Johnson tried to railroad through a hard Brexit by suspending Parliament And so the 31st October, beyond 31st of October, when by default we would come out. So it's now about how we get a general election and get a new Prime Minister, which for me should be Jeremy Corbyn, who would have his own negotiating team to try and negotiate Brexit with the EU, extending the deadline another 3 months.
So some news outlets
space to do that.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to ask you, some news outlets have called this current crisis unprecedented since the Second World War. You've described it in similar terms, but can you comment on that and expand on it, especially for our US audience who might not understand the real significance of this?
Well, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister who introduced Brexit, he did so. These are old Etonians. These are products of these public schools, which in the arcane language vocabulary of England of the British state are actually private schools. These elite educational institutions like Eton and Harrow and Fettes in Edinburgh, where I am, where Tony Blair spent his formative educational years, Oxford and Cambridge universities. These people are imbued with this born to rule entitlement. They're inculcated with this hubris, this ruling class hubris. And Cameron in his hubris, he didn't understand the country. When he introduced legislation to have this referendum in 2016, in order to clear the issue with his own backbenchers, Europe has always been a hot button issue within the Tory party, but not really beyond that in the country. He believed that Remain would win easily. But this was seen as an opportunity to give the establishment a kick in. And the Brexit vote was a scream from the bowels of austerity Britain, of people who suffered immeasurable economic harm as a result of Tory austerity. And they cast a vote. They had nothing to lose. Why do you care about free movement? They've not had the opportunity to travel to the next town, never mind to go and work in France or go and work in Germany. And I understand that. But since the collapse of neoliberalism, and with it the collapse of the centre ground in all but name, there's been a vacuum left. And that vacuum's been filled by the forces of reaction rather than the forces of the left, which I am on. We see a manifestation of that with Donald Trump. And Brexit is the British manifestation of that. The right has been winning the battle of the ideas when it comes to explaining the ravages of austerity, i.e. it's not inequality, it's not 30 years of Thatcherism, it's not the banks, it's not the greed of the rich, it's not the 1%, it's migrants, it's the foreigner, it's Brussels. And that has gained traction because Britain has never properly addressed, much less redressed, its imperial and colonial past. We have a ruling class that still believes that the empire was a good thing, that it wasn't an enterprising grand larceny, rapine, and raping other countries' economies. It was a good thing. It was spreading civilization to the world. And it's all dressed up with the pomp and ceremony that no country does better than Britain. And so the pathologies of a diseased culture came to the fore in the context of Brexit: nativism, xenophobia, British exceptionalism, and empire nostalgia. So this is why it's such a crisis, because it's a real crossroads for Britain. Is Britain going to go forward and going to address these things and these maladies of its past and move forward and understand its real place in the world, that we're not a major power and we shouldn't stop acting like one. We should act like a responsible country that advocates diplomacy and peace and stability. Britain is wedded to US foreign policy and has been for many, many years, since the end of the Second World War, and certainly since after the Suez Crisis. And its ruling class has benefited from that, but the working class has not benefited from that, much less the world. So not only poor people in this country or working class people in this country, but all over the world are crying out for a change in this paradigm whereby Britain and America storm around the world like an imperial juggernaut, smashing borders, no respecter of national sovereignty, no respecter of international law, and only sowing crises after crises.
Do you think this particular crisis is enough to wake up that elite class that you mentioned? Or do you think they're still going to just keep on keeping on?
Well, I don't think they'll be woken up until they're replaced. I don't think they'll be woken up. We need to take a bulldozer to Eton. We need to take a bulldozer to Harrow. These are hotbeds of extremism. These produce war criminal after war criminal. These are extremists in tailored suits. These are our fundamentalist Islamic madrasas, these establishments, and actually they do more damage and they're even more dangerous given the crimes that have issued out of these establishments. And until we address our history and properly and truthfully, the progress will never be made. You see the same in the United States. White supremacy defines America far more than democracy ever has, and it's the same here in the UK. We saw it with Charlottesville. We saw it with the lamentation of the Confederacy, and that produced Trump's election was in part, I would contend, a racist reaction to Obama. Not that I'm a fan of Obama, far from it, but this is a white supremacist state. We really have to tackle the roots of this white supremacy, and that, for me, are the ideological roots of the problems we're facing today.
And why is it, do you think, that the working classes that have been so disadvantaged by neoliberal and also conservative politics, you mentioned austerity, what is the reason that those populations who are so damaged by conservative politics nonetheless go the xenophobic route rather than pointing the finger at the actual source of their economic and other pain?
It's false consciousness, and that false consciousness is sown by a media that's controlled by a clutch of billionaires who are the real problem in our society. That's why alternative media is so important. That's why there's been such an attempt to close down alternative media, close down RT, close down alternative forms of media, police Facebook, police Twitter, police social media in total. But the media has a massive role to play in this. US media's tittle-tattle, the rich, the famous, celebrities, leaving behind millions of people who have not benefited from this neoliberal bonanza. The media plays a massive role in this, and that they have to take their share of the blame. I mean, they acted so surprised when Trump was elected, really. All of us could see it was going to happen. He was going to be elected, especially after the Democratic primaries were rigged to ensure Hillary Clinton was a Democratic Party candidate. We have a similar process here where the mainstream media has been going out of its way to attack and undermine Jeremy Corbyn, the spurious accusations of anti-Semitism, that he's somehow some communist spy, that he was when Czechoslovakia was a communist country, he was a spy for the Czechoslovakians in the 1970s, that he's some kind of monster, that he talks to terrorists, that he's a terrorist enabler and sympathiser and so on. They do more damage than 1,000 bayonets. I think it was Napoleon that said that 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets, and he was right.
I think that also explains why, you have these same elite interests who are so invested in shutting down independent press. You see, I just recently saw the headlines about the Pentagon wanting to act against what it says is disinformation. So do you think that effort to push back against independent media will be successful? And what role might that play kind of going forward, do you think?
Well, it's hard to know how successful it will be. I do think that people are awake now more than they've ever been. But the problem with social media, which is a fantastic tool for us, is that while there's a lot of information on it, there is a lot of misinformation on it. It's given rise to the spreading of conspiracy theory, of regressive politics. The far right's been able to harness social media to its advantage as well. But I do think it comes down to mainstream mainstream political parties like Labour, like the Democrats, allowing space for radicals, or radicals able to open up space. You see this with the Squad, the so-called Squad, Ilhan Omar and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and others in the Democrats. Bernie Sanders is getting the kind of platform he's never had before. Socialism is now part of the political vocabulary in the States, where before, when I lived there, it was a profanity. The rise of Corbyn. So there is space opening up. Extinction Rebellion, more awareness about climate change and about the danger to the environment. There is more space opening up. But this year for the UK will be highly critical. What happens in these next few weeks are going to be seminal in this country's history, and by extension, in what happens in the rest of the world.
Over to you, Joe.
I don't think you're understating that, John. I really don't. It can't be overstated how crucial this is in the history of Great Britain. But I want to go down to the more mundane things about the deal.
Yeah.
Corbyn never really, in my view, from what I understand, never really tried to dodge the question whether he was Remain or Brexit. But now, if he were to become prime minister, let's say, and he had time till January 22nd, whatever the date would be, for another extension, could he possibly get a better deal than Theresa May get? It seems like that's the best the EU was going to give. Wouldn't he have to come back with the same kind of deal?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? He feels confident he can get a deal. John McDonnell, his very able shadow chancellor, feels confident he can get a deal. Michel Barnier, who's the chief negotiator for the EU, said they're willing to listen to Corbyn's proposals. The issue around the backstop is key. The backstop is whereby a temporary border a non-border is maintained in the north of Ireland, which means the north of Ireland would still be under EU rules, and that's obviously not in keeping with the referendum result, and it's obviously exercising the minds of people who are pro-Brexit ideologues. So it remains to be seen. But here's what I think, Joe. If Corbyn can get a deal, if we come out under a Corbyn government, it is manifestly different. It's qualitatively different in terms of mass consciousness, because he's a socialist prime minister with a socialist programme coming out. It won't be anti-migrant. It'll be anti-corporations. It'll be anti-EU institutions. He'll maintain the rights of EU nationals who are currently living in the UK. It'll be under a much more progressive set of circumstances. I would support it in those circumstances. But a Corbyn government inside the EU would have a massive catalysing effect on progressive forces across Europe. You know, the right is on the march as it's never been since the 1930s. I mentioned Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen with her Front National in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Viktor Orban's government in Hungary, the rise of Matteo Salvini and his Eurosceptic anti-migrant. He was part of a coalition Italian government until recently with the Five Star Movement. So Euroscepticism was always a marginal political current in Europe. Now it's been elevated to mainstream. The EU at some point is going to have to wake up to what's going on around it, lapping up against its door, and it's going to have to move towards reform. The neoliberal model is dead. It has to run not in the interest of corporations and banks, but in the interest of its peoples. And unless they wake up to that fact, then they deserve to go the way of all flesh. It deserves to be consigned to the dustbin of history. The key question is, can it be reformed? You've got Yellow Jackets protesters every weekend in France protesting, being battened down by French riot police. They've been there for like 42, 43 weekends in a row. I went over to France in December and it was so inspiring. These people have commonality with people in the UK. If these struggles could be joined up across Europe, then my God, what a change that could be. That could change the whole paradigm. It could tip over the kitchen table, as it were. But Macron and Merkel, they have to understand that this neoliberal economic model is no longer fit for purpose.
You anticipate our next question about the EU and the fact that it desperately needs reforming, and this is what led to much of the reason for the Brexit vote. I recall a speech by Jacques Delors, I believe to the Trade Union Congress,
yes,
sometime in the 70s. He talked about the social market. And yes, that the EU would be good for the workers. And I think there was a sincerity then among some European leaders then about doing that. That is long gone. So we're between leave and remain with a horrible bureaucracy that is totally beholden to the banks, central banks and private banks.
Yes.
And leaving and creating chaos that we've seen in Britain. That speech by Delors, I want you to just talk about that and what's happened.
Let me tell you who killed the idea of a social Europe. Margaret Thatcher killed that.
Yeah.
She, in partnership with Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s, she introduced the Milton Friedmanite free market structural adjustment programs that have done so much damage around the world. And she was the one who injected the economic poison of neoliberalism into continental Europe. Continental Europe, traditionally France, Germany, had a high social wage, as Britain did in the 1970s, which means pensions, which means welfare state, unemployment. We have a national health service that was introduced at the end of the Second World War by the post-war Labour government. That would be under threat, by the way, under Brexit, at the hands of Donald Trump and the corporations that would be salivating over the prospect of breaking that up and privatising that. That cannot be allowed to happen. So Jacques Delors was sincere. You're absolutely right. But Margaret Thatcher and the onset of free market economics in the 1970s, the oil shocks in the early 70s, the liberalisation of credit and the rise of inflation, and that produced industrial action by workers whose wages were going down in value and so on and so on. That created all the industrial strife in the 1970s. But compared to now, the 1970s was a veritable utopia for workers across Europe. And so you're absolutely right. The EU has to reform. Can it be reformed back towards a social Europe? I have to hope that it can, because anything made by man and woman can be reformed by men and women, surely. And this is the argument of the pro-Brexit left, that the EU can never be reformed. Of course it can. Of course it can. It takes struggle. Socialism, which I advocate, doesn't come via a change in constitutional arrangement. It comes on the basis of mass struggle. And that's driven by consciousness, class, consciousness, not national consciousness. We've lapsed into nationalism and national particularism in the wake of the neoliberal economic crisis that was unleashed in 2008. And this is a situation of striking parallels in this regard with the 1930s. And we must learn from that period, or we are headed for perdition.
You mentioned before that Corbyn's victory would have a progressive impact on the continent. And, we saw in France, they resisted what they call the Anglo-Saxon models for work. Yeah. And then we got Sarkozy and now certainly Macron, a complete tool of the banks.
Yes.
And have unbelievably instituted pretty much the neoliberal policies that were resisted for so long, not only by the French public, even by officials, elected officials, members of the parliament. But now we see, you said the yellow jackets. If Corbyn should win, that would be maybe the trigger to get the kind of pressure on the EU from the various countries to reform. And I'm glad that you think that it can be. But I want to go back to the NHS view and anticipate my other question, which I think is going to be the last one. Yes, if there is no deal and the U.S. comes in, U.S. insurance companies, and we who live here in the U.S. I'm paying over $1,000 a month, $1,169 to be exact, for insurance. This is the kind of thing that Britons would be facing. However, if there's a rump, England and Britain, and Scotland becomes independent, Northern Ireland as well, joins the Republic, what would this mean for British workers who would see right over the border in Scotland, and maybe in Wales and in Ireland, a national health service like you got now? Yeah. How would they react to that? Would they be trying to flee to Scotland?
Well, this is an argument in favour of independence, Joe, because I think it would produce a shift in consciousness. If we have a more progressive Scotland bordering a regressive England, then working class people in England could not but help be influenced by that and say, wait a minute, why have they got decent social services? Why have they not got decent healthcare? Why have they not got a decent welfare state? And that would have its own catalysing impact. I think it was Lenin that said disunity for unity amongst workers. You have to change, maybe constitutionally, the existing arrangement to produce that space for a shift in consciousness. It's all about ideology and consciousness for me. And Scotland would not be burdened by a defence budget, a defence budget that's out of keeping with its needs, its real needs. If England tried to maintain a defence budget to try and keep its prestige on the world stage as a major power, at the expense of investing in social services and schools and hospitals and so on, then there would be an influence. We saw that Cuba, when the Cuban Revolution hit, had a massive influence on Latin America. That's why the Americans wanted to destroy it, because it wasn't anything bad it was doing; it's everything good that it was doing. And a country of 13 million. Well, think about the power of Cuba, not on the basis of its military or of aircraft carriers or stealth bombers, the power of its idea. Same with the Bolivarian Revolution. They hate the idea of a socialist alternative because they are in hock to the corporations and shareholders and multinational investors. So this is where things could be exciting. I hesitate to use that word because we can't play politics. It's not a parlour game. People's jobs are at stake. People's lives are at stake. But yet the US Health Service, I've said it to friends over here and people I know, because I lived in the States for 7 years. I didn't have health insurance and I needed to get health care. And I have strong memories of standing outside a charity hospital at 7 in the morning and trying to be one of the people who are fortunate enough to be selected to be given treatment on that particular day. That's what's coming down the track on the back of a no-deal Brexit. Donald Trump is not someone that can be trusted to respect the NHS. Boris Johnson has said that the NHS is off the table in any potential trade deal with the US. How can you trust this man? He's a serial liar. He's an old Etonian. He couldn't give a damn about working people, the welfare of working people, and he certainly couldn't give a damn about the NHS. The Tories hate the NHS. The only thing that's managed to sustain it is because the people depend on it, and people in Britain revere it. But there is attempts to undermine it, to degrade it, to starve it of funds, therefore to present a fait accompli saying we're no longer able to afford it. So it's a very worrying time, but also a time of great possibility. Crisis brings opportunity, as they say. It depends on whether an organised, properly constituted left can take advantage of these opportunities. It remains to be seen whether it can.
Well, John, I want to thank you, but I have one last question, which is, if there's a Prime Minister Corbyn and he gets a deal better than May's or the same, and he would he put that to the public in another referendum saying, accept this deal or remain, and then in effect having a second referendum?
Yes, that's what he's promised to do that in his manifesto. I think he's right to do so. Nobody knew what they were voting for. There was a lot of disinformation and misinformation, propaganda. 4% is not enough of a majority on such a seismic issue to satisfy the needs of democracy. This is democracy as a zero-sum game of winner take all, and it would have ramifications, as I mentioned earlier, for social cohesion going forward. He has pledged to put Remain on the ballot, but here's my view, and this has not been prayed in aid as yet. Remain is one of the extreme positions, and so is a hard Brexit. They should both be on the ballot, but they should have a 60% threshold, so that if that's reached, then most right-thinking people can be satisfied that it is the settled will of the British people. But that's the only basis on which I think Remain could possibly gain credibility of being on the ballot, given the result of the first referendum in 2016.
Well, we were joined by John Wight from Edinburgh to talk about the extraordinary events happening in Westminster right now that really do put the future of the United Kingdom in the balance here. And thank you, John, for joining us. And please send us your articles to Consortium News. We're really looking forward to that. If you can send us your stories. Thank you again, John. All the best.
Thank you. Been a pleasure. Thank you.